We are eagerly counting down to midnight to the start of Tax Day, which this year will be Teabag Day, the conservative movement organizing amorphously to oppose taxation, maybe, spending, maybe, President Obama's birth certificate, perhaps. It's not totally clear. But the adoption of their teabag as their symbol, now that is plain as a 1-2 punch to the face. The mass teabagging group MillionTeabags.com plans to dump 1 million teabags on the nation's capital tomorrow. Conservatives are being encouraged to teabag Obama, as you see there, teabag Pelosi, teabag liberal Democrats before they teabag you. Offices in D.C. have received notices like this one, which was posted by the cheerfully profane D.C. website Wonket. It reads, "Congratulations, you have been teabagged. You are one of the capital B bums that we intend to have thrown out of office." Here on Teabag Eve, one form of response to the great teabag gobsmack of 2009 is, of course, to laugh at it, even while trying to report on it, which is the prurient, juvenile approach that I admit I have taken over the past week. I can't help myself. Today, further illustration of why jerks like me can't be President of the United States. President Obama today seriously addressed his critics, taking them on as if he has been able to discern within the teabag blizzard some legitimate concerns that require rebuttal. Unlike giggling cable TV hosts, he has identified points of concern that people may have with him, and he logically walked through those concerns and gave his responses to them. President Obama's speech today explained what he thinks is going on in the economy and why he thinks it's going on. He enunciated and justified his policies to respond to the crisis. And in the process, he spelled out and answered the criticisms he has encountered from left, right, and center. And in the case of the teabaggers, from over the top.
Spending is not the solution.
It's putting hippos on the Titanic. That's all it's doing.
They are robbing my children. They are robbing them for the rest of their lives. They are robbing my grandchildren.
From grandchild robbery and Titanic hippos to the president's response.
You see, when this recession began, many families sat around the kitchen table and tried to figure out where they could cut back. And so have many businesses. And this is a completely reasonable and understandable reaction. But if every family in America, if every business in America cuts back all at once, then no one is spending any money, which means there are no customers, which means there are more layoffs, which means that the economy gets even worse. That's why the government has to step in and temporarily boost spending in order to stimulate demand. That's exactly what we're doing right now.
That makes sense. That's the paradox of thrift from Econ 101. That said, it's less fun than talking about hippos on the Titanic. He also took on conservative criticism about the deficit.
We're talking about a deficit in the trillion-dollar range for as far as the eye can see. The practical implications of this is bankruptcy for the United States. There's no other way around it.
Rather than pointing out that these same Republicans presided over the exploding deficit of the past 8 years, President Obama left that alone and identified the main culprit of the growing deficit that he attempts to deal with in his budget.
I absolutely agree that our long-term deficit is a major problem that we have to fix. The key to dealing with our long-term deficit and our national debt is to get a handle on out-of-control health care costs, not to stand idly by as the economy goes into freefall.
The president also answered the widespread frustration over the Wall Street bailout, as in, hey, where's my bailout, man?
I understand that TARP's not popular, and I have to say that I don't agree with some of the ways the TARP program was managed. But I do agree with the broader rationale that we must provide banks with the capital and the confidence necessary to start lending again. The truth is that $1 of capital in a bank can actually result in $8 or $10 of loans to families and businesses. So that's a multiplier effect that can ultimately lead to a faster pace of economic growth.
After putting on his professorial hat today and giving this speech, after rebutting the teabaggers, after rebutting his elected critics on the right, after rebutting Americans upset about the bailout, President Obama then took on his critics on the left, seeming to be pretty clearly responding to Nobel Prize-winning economist and frequent guest on this show, Paul Krugman. Mr. Krugman has chastised the White House for not getting it over with and just nationalizing the banks.
We believe that preemptive government takeovers are likely to end up costing taxpayers even more in the end, and because it's more likely to undermine than create confidence. Governments should practice the same principle as doctors. First, do no harm.
So the president took them all on. The reasonable on the right, the reasonable on the left, and the nonsense from the know-nothings across the board. How'd he do? Well, joining us now is former Vermont Governor Howard Dean, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, now a contributor to CNBC. Governor Dean, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me on, Rachel.
So do you think this speech today was at all timed to pre-butt the protests that are going to happen tomorrow?
I actually don't think so. I think he's, I'm actually, I have to say, I was just listening to the speech. I'm a little surprised at how much I agree with him. I revere Paul Krugman. I think he's one of the smartest people in America. And this one, I actually agree with President Obama. We really do have to spend some money that I, as a fiscal conservative, don't like spending, but we've got to get the economy going again, primarily so small businesses that are in good shape don't collapse. And that's what happens in bad recessions. People with good balance sheets collapse as well as bad balance sheets. So I don't think this has anything to do with the Tea Party. When you're winning, why take on people who are having teabag parties or whatever they are? But I do think, and I particularly liked his very plain language. This was aimed right at middle America and explained in very plain language, as you put it, Econ 101. I thought it was a really good speech.
In terms of the political strategy here, I was struck by the timing just because it seems like these weren't straw man arguments. He wasn't building up arguments that were easy to knock down. He seemed to be taking on arguments from the right that don't really exist, honestly. He's taking on arguments as if they are he's being more rationally criticized than he is right now. Republicans
I agree.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That's why I don't think he's responding to the Tea Party, whatever they call it, because there's no real message in that. I mean, people are mad. Okay, well, that's fine. But there's no real focused message on the part of the people who are doing the teabag party. What Obama was doing, I think, was explaining things that ought to be explained. What about these big deficits? People should be worried about those. What about a government bailing out the banks? Those are legitimate questions that lots of people have concerns about, not just the fulminating talk show hosts on the far right. And those concerns deserve to be answered, and I think he did that. I do think it was a really good speech. And what I thought was so great about it totally lacked the soaring rhetoric of most of his speeches. It's look him right in the eyes on Main Street and explain in very plain language why he's doing what he's doing. And that is why he is at 68% in terms of his ability to handle the economy. And that's why the Republicans are at about 23%.
On policy, health care is obviously a very important issue to you and has been throughout your career. When the president named increasing health care costs as the policy issue that he's going to use to explain why the deficits are so high, putting health care reform in the context of fiscal conservatism, essentially, how did you feel about that?
I think that's exactly the right tack. People have been talking about doing health care for the uninsured for a long time. That doesn't move people. What does move people is the understanding that our companies are not competitive, not just with Chinese companies, which pay a lot less money. They're not competitive with Canadian companies because Canadian companies aren't saddled with this incredible cost that goes up at 2 or 3 times the rate of inflation every year for 30 years. This has to be fixed if you want long-term economic health. I think the president gets it. He's also talked about education, which is even further out a further out problem that needs to be fixed. He really wants to fix the economy, not just put Band-Aids on it, and I think you ought to get credit for that.
Looking at what the Republicans are proposing, looking at the House Republican budget, for example, looking at the Republican Economic Solutions website that was put out today, looking, frankly, at the Tea Parties tomorrow, which dozens of Republican congressmen are taking part in, I'm wondering if the real substantive policy debate in Washington is actually among Democrats right now. It doesn't feel like the Republicans are really participating.
There is no substance among the Republicans. They are badly wounded. They're trying to figure out how to come back. There's no agreement among themselves how to do it. And none of them have the courage to do what Michael Steele started to do, which is to take on the right wing of his own party. They've got a terrible problem. The New York Times did a good job this week talking about this. They've gotten to be a much smaller party and a much, much more conservative party. They've almost become a regional party, and they're way out of the mainstream. And they want to use the formula that got them back in '94, which is to get the mainstream to come to them. But unfortunately, the new generation is moving in the other direction.